Now the first thing I do in this video is to continue to work on the framing, and even though there wasn't much left, I still had more to do, especially in front of the boat. Now sometimes during this build I could not use screws to connect pieces together simply because of the lack of accessibility. Now this is one of those cases. There's no room for my drill under the bottom plate, and since I'm not a big fan of pocket holes, I decided to use epoxy and glue the stud in place. And to line things up nicely, I used a hardwood dowel, and I did thicken the epoxy with a high density filler. By the way, I'm using for this entire project Best System epoxy. It is most definitely not the cheapest epoxy out there, but I'm pretty happy with it. It's easy to work with, and they have a wide range of hardeners and fillers and accessories, which means you always can get exactly what you need for all kinds of different epoxy projects. Now on multiple occasions I had to use some tie-down straps to make sure everything is straight and plumb before I glue the next part in place. And since I hate to pull out my tape measure 1,000 times a day, I got into the habit of cutting measuring sticks from scrap pieces, especially when I know I have to use the same measurement over and over again. This way I am faster and more precise. That being said though, I'm sometimes really shocked how little mistakes start to add up. There's so many spots in this boat where I'm up to 1/4 of an inch off, which can be super frustrating when you figure that one out after you glued something in place, and you can't really go back and fix it unless you're basically willing to start from scratch. Now, what that means for me is that sometimes I have to force myself to really let it go and to realize that in the big picture it won't matter structurally, and it's not going to be noticeable visually either. So there's really no point in getting hung up on little mistakes like that, and it's just time to move on to the next step. As you can see here, I got part of the paneling for the boat done, and before I keep going on the other side, I thought I'll switch things up and start covering all those screw holes. I also have to fix a couple spots in the plywood itself. There's some minor defects, not a big deal. The basic idea here is to create a uniform and smooth surface for the next step. Now this step was quite lengthy and boring, which is why I tried to alternate between fitting and installing plywood and epoxy work. I also tried to get some epoxy between the plywood sheets. Usually you would frame in some blocking between the studs so the plywood edges land on something nice and flat. But I decided to use chunks of flat steel to line up the edges, squeeze in some epoxy, and once cured I just took them out again. That way I saved some framing material, and it might seem a little bit silly, but I'm also saving weight, and if you keep making those little decisions, they actually start to add up eventually. Now wrestling those plywood sheets up and down was quite exhausting, to say the least. This might be a good time to talk about the dimensions. The boat is about 8 foot and 9 inch high. That does not include the 2 keel rails. The hull is 20 foot and 7.5 inch long from stern to bow, not including the overhang of the roof at the back, and it is 8 foot wide. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I use screws for all the panels. Nails are just not really suitable for this. Even though they have a greater shear strength, they don't hold as well in wood as a screw does. And keep in mind, this is not a stationary object like a house or a shed. This is an object that is going to be exposed to a lot of movement and vibrations, so I need a fastener that cannot be easily pulled out. I also use tighter spacing between the screws than you usually would in a more traditional framing method. That way, in my mind anyways, I compensate a little bit for the weaker shear strength of the screws versus a nail. I use GRK fasteners mainly because I don't have to pre-drill, and thanks to the unique design, that saves me a lot of time. Now that feature was actually quite important when I screwed down the plywood to the arches of the roof. They're only 3/4 of an inch thick, and without pre-drilling with a standard screw, I would have split the wood guaranteed. Also, they use a Torx drive, which I personally prefer over every other drive out there. Because it is easy enough to do, I decided to use the same epoxy high-density filler mix to put a bead along the seams on the arches. One of the arches was for some reason a little bit off, even though I built them all with the same jig. It kind of created a little gap between arch and plywood, and of course I could use the screws to pull the plywood down tight, but then I would have a noticeable dip on the roof. The better way to solve this in my mind is to fill the gap with epoxy. Now this would be hard to do with just a putty knife. Caulking gun works much better. Best System actually offers a fillable caulking tube. They're really nice to work with, and if you're careful enough you can push the plunger back out of the tube with some kind of rod or dowel. And once the leftover epoxy is cured, you can flex and squeeze the tube and peel the epoxy right out of it. Compressed air works pretty well too, and then you can use the tube again. I tried different methods to squeeze the bead nicely in the corner, from store-bought silicone spatulas to all kinds of homemade caulking tools, and so far nothing beats the good old finger method, of course covered by a glove. I just have a much better feeling for the surfaces and the amount of material that I'm pushing along, and it's easier to make micro adjustments in a split second. That being said though, it doesn't have to be pretty anyways, because all of those walls will be covered eventually. It's amazing though how much strength it adds to the structure. I definitely could tell the difference when working on a roof. It's really rock solid now. Now this whole paneling process did take me about a full week. There's still spots where I have to work on. It's not quite done yet. But it's always super exciting when the progress that you make is so noticeable. With the walls and the roof up now, you really can imagine how the boat is gonna look like. Now I'm gonna wrap up the video at this point, and if you're curious to see what progress I make on this big project in the future, then just subscribe to this channel and I will make sure to keep you updated. And if you're wondering why on earth the sander has eyeballs on it, then you might want to direct that question to my 12-year-old stepdaughter, and trust me, it's not the only thing in this garage that has eyeballs on it right now.
Watch out! What you looking at?